In the 1970s, John Barry challenged the view of acculturation as a zero-sum process, in which immigrants must give up the culture of their country of origin to make room for the culture of a new host society. Rather than measuring identification with origin and host cultures as opposing, mutually exclusive choices, Barry suggested separate parallel measures of identification with origin and host cultures. Separate measures allow an empirical test of the assimilationist hypothesis that a healthy personality has room for only one culture at a time. Reflecting this suggestion, the 2013 Canadian General Social Survey included two questions. How would you describe your sense of belonging to Canada? And how would you describe your sense of belonging to people with the same ethnic or cultural background as you? Each with a 5-point scale from weak to strong belonging. Survey responses to these two questions were positively rather than negatively correlated. Barry and his colleagues later identified 4 different styles of immigrant acculturation based on possible high scores of 4 or 5 versus low scores of 1 to 3 on each of the bidimensional scale questions. Both scores high they called integration. Both scores low they called marginalization. Assimilation meant a high score for only the host society, and separation meant a high score for only the origin culture. Most of the Canadian GSS respondents appear in the integration category, which the bidimensional research tradition has linked to the best life outcomes for mental health and happiness among immigrants. More recently, Carlson and Hou suggested an improved way to analyze responses to these questions about belonging. Cultural involvement is the sum of the scores on the two questions divided by 2, giving a continuous scale with Barry's original integration category as the high endpoint and the original marginalization category as the low endpoint. Cultural preference is the difference between the scores on the two questions, again divided by 2, giving another continuous scale between Barry's separation category as the positive endpoint and the assimilation category as the negative endpoint. Involvement and preference scores retain all the information of the original scale values of each question. Both a CI score and a CP score appear for each respondent, unlike the older approach that divides respondents unevenly into 4 supposedly homogeneous, mutually exclusive categories. Mean values of involvement and preference for each of the earlier 4 categories of GSS respondents show the expected shift towards each of the 4 endpoints of our continuous scales, but also reflect the positive correlation between strength of belonging to origin and host cultures, since these group means are slightly off-center in both horizontal and vertical directions in this figure. Barry originally studied immigrant acculturation within a larger context of intergroup relations that we examine here as a more general phenomenon we call ethnic accommodation. For example, we include Canadian First Peoples, whose presence goes back centuries before the arrival of European immigrants. We also consider respondents who identified themselves as belonging to the visible minority category of Black, or who reported Chinese or South Asian origins, distinguishing in these 3 ethnic groups between those who immigrated into Canada and those who were born in Canada. We consider the ethnic group of white French Canadians, distinguishing between those living in the province of Quebec and in the balance of the country. As a reference group, we include all other Canadian-born white respondents who did not report a French ethnic identity. We observe interesting variations in mean CI and CP scores for these major ethnic groups in Canada. With the exception of French Canadians living in Quebec, all groups average preference scores, half the difference of feeling ethnic minus feeling Canadian, shifted slightly toward the assimilation rather than the separation side of the CP dimension, shown here on the horizontal axis. We find greater variation across ethnic groups for average involvement scores, plotted on the vertical axis, half the sum of feeling ethnic plus feeling Canadian. The most interesting pattern contrasts immigrants with Canadian-born members in the 3 groups with large shares of recent arrivals: South Asians, Chinese, and Black respondents. In each case, immigrants have noticeably higher involvement scores than do their Canadian-born co-ethnics. These higher CI scores for immigrants reflect higher scores on both feeling ethnic and feeling Canadian, not simply greater salience of the ethnic question by itself. In each case, scores on the two original survey questions are positively correlated within each of these groups and higher for immigrants in all groups. French Canadians living outside Quebec also have higher CI scores than those remaining in Quebec. This may further support Berry's integration hypothesis about multiple dimensions of group identification having synergistic rather than antagonistic effects. We consider not only the plotted mean values of CI and CP as point estimates for each ethnic group, but also the shape of the cloud of individual values clustered around each group's mean. Such a distribution could stretch in a vertical direction, with smaller variance in preference scores and larger variance in involvement scores. This vertical stretching implies that rather than being incompatible and mutually exclusive, the two kinds of involvement may be mutually reinforcing. This should occur in settings that encourage multicultural openness and make it possible for people to combine different aspects of their identities. On the other hand, if people have a fixed total potential for cultural identification, feeling Canadian would always come at the expense of feeling ethnic, and the two belonging scores would always sum to a similar CI total for everyone. All variation would be stretched horizontally along the CP axis. Such a case would approximate the old assimilationist model, demanding that choice of one cultural identity must come at the expense of the other. This should occur in social settings that create barriers between ethnic groups and that make mutual accommodation a challenging and costly process in terms of personal identities. These alternative shapes for the distribution of any group around mean values of involvement and preference can be captured by a simple ratio of the variances of CI and CP, which we call the accommodation index. A ratio of 1.0 could occur if the cloud of individuals are evenly distributed around the central point marked by mean CI and mean CP for the group. If the ratio is greater than 1, members of that group are scattered vertically along the CI dimension with reduced variation along the horizontal CP dimension. If the ratio is less than 1, members of that group are dispersed horizontally along the CP dimension with reduced variation along the vertical CI dimension. For all considered ethnic groups in the 2013 Canadian GSS sample, this ratio is greater than 1. Each ethnic group stretched vertically along the cultural involvement axis, with horizontal dispersion along the cultural preference axis relatively compressed. This pattern of elliptical distribution stretched along the vertical CI axis may indicate a general multicultural openness in the host society. The greatest relative stretching along the vertical CI dimension appears for the majority white native-born Canadian respondents, both French and non-French, an unsurprising result, but reassuring in terms of interpreting the ratio in this way. First Peoples and Canadian-born South Asian respondents also exhibit ratios of variances that are almost as high as those of native-born white Canadians. In contrast, Black respondents, particularly those born in Canada, report accommodation index values closest to 1. Black and Chinese immigrants, along with Canadian-born Chinese, also reported lower index values than other groups. Low variance ratios may reflect greater barriers to entry into mainstream Canadian society and a consequent requirement to choose either an ethnic or a mainstream Canadian identity. But we do not know the source of such barriers. They could originate in the attitudes and actions of the mainstream society, or could also originate within an ethnic community itself. Such a distinction probably could be identified only through intensive first-person field research. If our interpretation of this ratio is correct, Canadian-born Black respondents face the highest barriers that make mutual accommodation among groups a challenging and costly process in terms of personal identities. However, it should be pointed out that even for this ethnic subgroup in the Canadian GSS sample, the ratio remains greater than 1.